The morning of June 12, 2026 was meant to be the dawn of a new era for North American infrastructure. Invitations were in hand, dignitaries were staged, and the ribbon was prepped for a grand opening that would symbolize the endurance of the longest undefended border on the planet. Instead, the silence that fell over the Gordie Howe International Bridge was deafening. By the night of June 11th, the ceremony had been scrubbed from the calendar without a whisper of explanation from either government. This was not a scheduling conflict. It was not a technical glitch. It was a calculated, last-minute exertion of American leverage. To understand the weight of this silence, one must look at the ledger. Canada did not just participate in this project. Canada financed it entirely. Every dollar of the $6.4 billion Canadian dollar price tag came from the Canadian taxpayer. The United States provided zero capital. Michigan provided zero capital. Yet, when the clock struck the final hour before the crossing was set to open, the Trump administration intervened directly. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, acting on behalf of the White House, moved to block the opening, signaling that the structural ownership and revenue sharing agreements signed in 2018 were now, by Washington's estimation, open for renegotiation. This is the hidden architecture of current North American trade. It is no longer about the steel, the concrete, or the efficiency of cross-border logistics. It is about the weaponization of assets. The timeline reveals the strategy. February 2026 saw President Trump publicly demand a 50% ownership stake in the bridge, despite the existing legal framework providing Canada with full title and the right to recoup its massive investment through future tolls. Washington knows that Canada is currently cornered. Under Article 34.7 of CUSMA, the clock is ticking toward the July 1st mandatory 6-year trade review. This is the most dangerous date in our modern economic history. The bridge, which handles 25% of all US-Canada trade, has been transformed from a vital logistics artery into a geopolitical hostage. Washington is operating on a clear, ruthless calculus: extract concessions on the bridge. And you hold the leverage to dictate terms for the broader CUSMA renewal. The economic reality is stark. The corridor between Windsor and Detroit moves approximately $323 million in goods every single day. The automotive industry, the lifeblood of this region, operates on just-in-time manufacturing models where every minute of delay ripples through the assembly lines, turning inventory shortages into million-dollar-per-hour losses. By keeping the Gordie Howe Bridge locked, the US effectively exerts a tax on the Canadian economy without ever having to pass a piece of legislation. It is a slow-motion strangulation of trade throughput that forces Ottawa to reconsider its position on everything from dairy quotas to the tightening rules of origin for electric vehicle components. Some observers point to the Ambassador Bridge, a privately held asset, as the silent beneficiary of this standoff. When the owner of a private crossing funnels millions into the political machinery that now dictates cross-border policy, and that policy results in the indefinite closure of a competitive public alternative, the line between private interest and national policy vanishes. The decision to keep the Gordie Howe Bridge closed protects a monopoly that has historically dominated this crossing for decades. It is not a policy disagreement. It is a market preservation operation executed by the state. The official line from Prime Minister Mark Carney's office remains one of calm, framing the delay as a minor matter of weeks. But the bond markets and supply chain managers are reading the subtext. They see the 4% drop in Canadian automotive sales this year and the freezing of capital investment in cross-border facilities. They understand that when a superpower shifts from a partner to a transactional adversary, the risk profile of every investment changes. The uncertainty surrounding CUSMA, combined with the hostage-taking of the bridge, has created a volatility trap that is already bleeding billions from the North American economy. We are witnessing the end of the post-Cold War era of predictable trade. We are entering a phase where infrastructure is treated as a strategic asset to be squeezed for every drop of political capital. Mexico has already signaled its pivot, aligning its regulatory framework with Washington's demands to secure its own position, leaving Canada to face this pressure in relative isolation. The diplomatic noise is designed to obfuscate the reality. The terms of the next decade of North American economic integration are being written in a border detention center, and the pen is being held by a government that has decided friendship is secondary to leverage. The bridge will eventually open, but the price of admission is rising by the hour. Canada's $6.4 billion investment was meant to generate prosperity. Instead, it has become the primary site of a structural economic war. The July 1st deadline approaches with the bridge still shuttered, the trade review stalled, and the fundamental question of Canada's economic autonomy more exposed than it has been in half a century. But the most consequential question remains unanswered. The silence surrounding the Gordie Howe International Bridge is not a diplomatic pause. It is a calculated reconfiguration of North American economic architecture. While the public is fed narratives of unresolved issues, the financial architecture beneath the project reveals a deliberate attempt by Washington to rewrite the fundamental terms of engagement between two sovereign nations. To grasp how we arrived here, we must look at the specific machinery of this standoff. First, consider the original 2012 Crossing Agreement. It was a masterpiece of project finance, structured to insulate the public asset from the volatility of national politics. The Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority, a Canadian Crown corporation, took on the full design, construction, financing and maintenance liability. In exchange, Canada secured the right to prioritise its repayment of the $6.4 billion Canadian dollar capital expenditure through toll revenues. The state of Michigan was a partner in name and governance, but not in capital. The agreement was legally binding, ratified by both capitals, and designed to function like a self-sustaining utility. Washington's current effort to demand ownership and immediate toll sharing isn't a renegotiation. It is an ex post facto extraction attempt designed to force Canada into a subordinate financial position. CTV News' Show 1 Second, the strategic leverage being deployed is synchronized with the Article 34.7 CUSMA review clock. The White House has identified the bridge as a force multiplier for its broader negotiating agenda. By holding the ribbon-cutting hostage, Washington creates a liquidity trap for the Canadian automotive supply chain. Every day the bridge remains shuttered is a day that cross-border logistics costs inflate. This is not incidental. It is an economic signal meant for corporate boardrooms. The administration is signalling to major manufacturers, GM, Stellantis, and the broader parts supplier network, that their just-in-time operations are secondary to American trade demands. When a supply chain is already stressed by Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, the closure of a critical capacity expanding asset forces companies to either absorb the cost or relocate production to the US interior. This is the structural mechanism of forced nearshoring. Third, look at the alignment of private interests and state policy. The Ambassador Bridge, a privately held monopoly, has historically been the sole commercial juggernaut in the Windsor-Detroit corridor. The owner, Matthew Maroon, has deep-seated ties to the current political movement in Washington. The Gordie Howe Bridge was explicitly designed to break this monopoly. By using the Department of Transportation and the State Department to block the opening, the administration isn't just securing a geopolitical win. It is effectively protecting a private revenue stream against public sector competition. This creates a dangerous precedent where public infrastructure is no longer a neutral utility for trade, but a captured asset used to reward political allies and punish trade rivals. Wikipedia, Show 1. The implications for the broader CUSMA review are profound. Washington is using this delay to test the limits of Canadian sovereignty. By demanding immediate changes to the bridge's revenue structure, the US is essentially asking, if you will hand over your infrastructure revenue under pressure, what will you give up on dairy market access, digital services taxation, or rules of origin? Every concession made on the bridge will be treated as the baseline for the next round of CUSMA negotiations. This is not a story about a bridge. It is a story about the transition from a rules-based, predictable trade environment to a transactional, power-based system. The zombie CUSMA scenario, where we avoid an outright collapse but drift into a decade of annual high-stakes reviews, is exactly the environment the White House desires. It keeps Canadian investment in a state of perpetual, paralysing uncertainty. The financial logic is clear. The United States is no longer interested in the efficiency of the North American trade corridor. It is interested in the control of it. And as we approach the July 1st checkpoint, the question that should worry every Canadian is not when the bridge will open, but what part of our economic sovereignty will be surrendered to unlock the gates. The indefinite shuttering of the Gordie Howe International Bridge is not an isolated bureaucratic hiccup. It is the physical manifestation of a profound strategic pivot in North American relations. By holding a Canadian-financed asset hostage, Washington has successfully transformed a routine trade review into a high-stakes arena of asymmetrical power, proving that the era of predictable, rule-based cooperation has been decisively replaced by a transactional, leverage-first framework. The implications for Canada's sovereignty and economic security are severe. For decades, the Canada-US relationship was anchored in the assumption that trade was a positive-sum game, bolstered by institutional stability and mutual reliance. That consensus has fractured. The current standoff demonstrates that even the most vital infrastructure, the backbone of our $1.9 trillion trilateral trade architecture, can be weaponized at the whim of the White House to achieve narrow political concessions. We are no longer navigating a trade negotiation. We are contending with a containment strategy. When we look at the bigger picture, this is a clear warning for the defense, energy, and automotive sectors. Washington's willingness to disrupt the most integrated industrial corridor on the planet, to force a shift in revenue sharing or regulatory compliance signals that no sector is immune from being utilized as a bargaining chip. The zombie CUSMA scenario, where the agreement remains in force but under a constant cloud of annual review, creates an environment where long-term capital investment in Canada effectively freezes. Businesses cannot commit to 20-year infrastructure or manufacturing projects when the legal bedrock of their trade access is under biennial threat. This environment stands in stark contrast to the pre-2016 era. We have shifted from a partner-first mentality to a concession-first reality. Canada's strategy of quiet diplomacy and technical compliance is meeting a brick wall of American protectionism that prioritizes domestic manufacturing optics and political retribution over continental efficiency. Mexico has already recognized this shift, front-loading its own regulatory changes to align with Washington's demands and carving out a position as a compliant partner. Canada, by contrast, is being forced to play an increasingly defensive game, attempting to insulate its supply chains while simultaneously trying to manage a relationship that is fundamentally skewed. The broader global implication is that North America's shared competitiveness is eroding. While the region collectively accounts for 30% of global GDP, this internal friction creates a massive vacuum that external competitors, specifically China and the emerging economies of the global south, will not hesitate to exploit. By prioritizing short-term leverage over structural stability, the US is inadvertently weakening the very foundation of its own economic dominance. We are now careening toward July 1st. Whether or not a renewal of CUSMA is announced, the damage to investor confidence is already baked into the market. The next critical juncture is not just the deadline itself, but the specific terms of the deal, or the lack thereof, that emerges from the wreckage of this negotiation. If Ottawa chooses to concede on the bridge or on core supply management issues to secure a short-term win, it will set a dangerous precedent for every trade dispute to follow. The path ahead requires a radical reassessment of our economic dependencies. We cannot continue to build our future on the assumption that our largest partner will play by the rules when those rules no longer serve their domestic political narrative. The bridge remains closed, the trade clock is ticking, and the reality of our new, transactional North America is coming into sharp focus. The question for every Canadian is no longer how we preserve the old order, but how we survive the new one.